In pretty much every setting I've ever been in, I've heard people bad-mouthing others. And I myself have been guilty of doing that in the past. So this guy's so annoying or weird, or steer clear of this guy, he's got such a poor work ethic, or he's so lazy. In other words, they're poisoning the well. They're biasing you against these people. But this is wholeheartedly unethical and unfair to these people. And in this video, I want to illustrate why. So I'm going to go ahead and break this down into two parts. In the first part, we'll take a look at the perspective of the instigators of bias, what their motives are, and what that implies about their perspectives. And in the second part, we'll take a look at the perspective of the recipient of bias and talk about those same things. So starting with the perspective of the instigator, what are their motives? I'd argue that it's just as simple as a means of deflection. They're trying to put the negative spotlight on somebody else just so that it doesn't have to be on them. So in other words, if I can go around corralling everybody's support to agree that this one person is some kind of social outcast, then I myself don't have to be it. And I'd argue even further that the origins of that can be traced back to evolutionary psychology in prehistoric times when we were living in small tribal societies, because at that time, being cast out from your tribe meant that you probably weren't going to survive. And so at some point along the way, people figured out that if they collectively agreed to cast somebody else out, then they themselves could remain as the tribe and survive and make it into the next generation. And so it makes sense that that mentality has permeated its way through generations even till today, even though society is dramatically different today than it was back then, because there is no threat to your survival in ordinary settings like in school or work or when you're hanging out with your friends or something like that. Yet we still think that there is. That's how we are hardwired to behave. And so what does this imply about the perspective? That it's wholeheartedly not credible at all, because it's not based in facts and reality. It's just an emotional, irrational, I want to make somebody else the outcast so that I don't have to be it. And even if you want to argue for a second that maybe the opinion is valid, that when someone's bad-mouthing somebody else, it's coming from a position of this is my actual opinion of that person, then you just have to ask yourself, why are they coming up to you and telling you that? The only reason they're doing that is because they're exaggerating it for impact. They want to rally you to support their cause so that they don't have to be the outcast and that other person that they don't like can be the outcast. So for example, I saw this happening a lot in the Army because people transfer from unit to unit a lot. And every time somebody transfers, the losing unit biases the gaining unit against that person. So when I first got to my unit as a brand new platoon leader, people started trying to bias me against one of my soldiers. They said, hey, you got to watch out for this guy. He's lazy, he's got a poor work ethic and all that stuff. But because I was able to remain free of bias and I was aware of the message I'm trying to send in this video, I didn't let that bias affect me. And then eventually I found out, having kept an open mind, that this soldier was actually the exact opposite type of person than what they were trying to portray him out to be. He turned out to be one of the best soldiers in the entire platoon, and it turned out that most people just didn't like him for one reason or the other, and so they were trying to make him out to be some kind of outcast. So now let's take a look at the perspective of the recipient of bias. What are their motives when they're giving into bias? I'd say there are at least two. For one, it's always easier to give in to the popular opinion. So if everybody else agrees on something, then, hey, there's probably a shred of credibility there, right? And it's probably true even though I haven't done my own research. And on top of that, it's easier for me because I don't have to do my own research. And number two is you don't want to stand up and be the sole dissenter, which goes back to that same evolutionary psychology we were talking about a second ago. No one wants to stand up and say, hey, this guy's actually a good person and not a bad person, when everybody else is saying the exact opposite, because then they might cast you out as well. And so what does this imply about your perspective? At least two things again. That your perspective is subjective and not objective. So you're going to start looking for the things that people have portrayed to you as negative characteristics of somebody else and ignoring everything else. So let's say, for example, somebody comes up to you and says, hey, have you seen James's jacket today? It's so weird. Why would anybody wear that to school? Then the next time you see James, you're going to start scrutinizing him and scrutinizing his jacket because you've been biased to do that. And so eventually it's going to turn into a confirmation bias where you look for the evidence to support your original conjecture and you ignore everything else. So eventually you're going to start saying, okay, yeah, I guess I can see why that's a weird jacket, and now James does look kind of weird and out of place. When the reality is you probably wouldn't care. I know that I wouldn't care if I wasn't biased in that way, and I still try to remain relatively free of bias, and yet here I am judging him on something that doesn't have anything to do with his character. And that's the second problem, is you are dismissing people on the basis of really nothing, just some kind of baseless claim or some kind of portrayal of them that's been tainted by somebody else's opinion rather than being objective and fact-based. And so that's why it's so unethical, because you're not giving James a fair shot to prove to you who he is as a person. Instead, you're just dismissing him because of the jacket that he wears or something else frivolous like that. So don't go around bad-mouthing others just because you don't want the spotlight to be on you, and don't be so quick to give into biases just because you're too afraid to come to your own conclusions about somebody. Instead, give people a fair shot. Don't listen to what everybody else is saying about them, and instead, get to know them for who they are. Because if nothing else, you would want that same courtesy extended to you. So I hope this helps, and I'll see you in the next video.